All right, today we're jumping into a really powerful analysis that tries to unpack the history that shaped the modern Muslim world. And the argument is pretty provocative. It says that much of what we think of as ancient and unchanging is actually, well, pretty recent.
So let's just start with the big question that's at the heart of this whole thing. There's this common idea that the very rigid, very political forms of Islam we see today are just how it's always been, an inseparable part of the faith. But what if that's not the case at all? What if we've been misreading the history?
According to this analysis, the whole story hinges on one single pivotal year, 1979. This was the year when a few huge, seismic events all happened at once, and together they completely redrew the religious and political map of the Muslim world.
Okay, so here's the core argument. The kind of enforced religious uniformity and state control you see in many Muslim-majority countries today, that isn't some timeless feature of Islam. It's actually a pretty modern invention, something that was built and exported starting in the 1970s, thanks to a perfect storm of petrodollars and Cold War politics.
But to really get how massive this change was, we kind of have to rewind the clock. We need to look at what the Muslim world was like before this big break. And the picture that emerges is one of incredible pluralism.
And, just look at the diversity here. In the mid-20th century, Cairo was this buzzing hub where Marxists, secular nationalists, and religious scholars were all arguing in the same cafes. Beirut was a genuinely cosmopolitan city where ideas from different faiths mixed. And if you traveled from Turkey to West Africa, you'd find this amazing tapestry of different local traditions and Sufi practices. It wasn't a monolith at all. But, and this is really important, we shouldn't romanticize it. This past wasn't some perfect liberal utopia. You absolutely had intolerant movements back then, too. The Muslim Brotherhood had a political vision, and the early Wahhabi movement was already pushing a very strict, puritanical version of the faith. The key is that these were just some of the competing ideas in the mix. What happened next would tilt the scales dramatically.
Right, so 1979 didn't just happen out of the blue. The stage had already been set by two major events in the years just before. You basically had an ideological vacuum open up, and then a flood of money appeared to fill it.
First up, 1967, the Six-Day War. For the Arab world, this was so much more than a military defeat. It was an ideological catastrophe. The big idea of the time, secular Arab nationalism, the dream of leaders like Egypt's Nasser, was just shattered. And into that huge political void stepped Islamist movements, which had been waiting in the wings.
Then you get to 1973, the oil crisis. Suddenly, oil prices go through the roof, and Saudi Arabia becomes unimaginably wealthy. Now, they'd had their very specific, very rigid interpretation of Islam for a while, but what they didn't have was the money to export it on a global scale. After 73, they had the fuel to power their movement worldwide. So you can really see it here like a long fuse being lit. In 67, the old ideas collapse, creating a demand for something new. Then, in 73, a ton of money shows up to supply a specific new vision. The whole thing was just primed to explode. And that brings us right to the explosion itself, 1979. In just a matter of months, three completely separate, world-altering events happened, and each one acted like a catalyst, lighting a fire that would transform public Islam across the globe.
First, there was the Iranian Revolution. Now, the big deal here for the rest of the world wasn't really the specifics of its Shia theology. The real impact was that it was a proof of concept. For the first time, everyone saw that, yes, an Islamic revolution in the modern world was possible. You could actually topple a secular government and rebuild a state around religious authority. Second, a shocking event in Mecca. A group of militants seized the Grand Mosque, accusing the Saudi royal family of being corrupt sellouts. It was a massive crisis for the regime's legitimacy. So after they put the siege down, the royals made a deal. They essentially gave the ultra-conservative Wahhabi religious establishment way more power over Saudi society in exchange for their political support. And third, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The response, led by the US and Saudi Arabia, was to fund and arm the Mujahideen fighters. But this proxy war did more than just fight the Soviets. It basically created and normalized a global armed jihadist movement, bringing in fighters from all over the world and giving them training, a shared ideology, and international networks.
So you put those three earthquakes together, and the fallout is just immense. It kicks off what you could call the standardization of Islam. All of a sudden, there's this systematic, incredibly well-funded push to replace all those diverse local traditions with one single, exported, and much more rigid model of the faith. And this wasn't just an idea, it was a concrete playbook. States started funding thousands of mosques across the planet. But there was a catch. You had to follow their doctrine. They trained foreign students in state-approved theology and sent them home to become the new religious authorities. And they printed and distributed millions of Qurans with their own specific commentary, making their interpretation the new default. And what's really fascinating here is the dynamic this created. You had these two competing models, revolutionary Shia Iran and the conservative Sunni monarchy in Saudi Arabia. They were bitter rivals, right? But here's the twist. They ended up pushing the world in the same direction. Both were hostile to any kind of diversity. Both exported their ideology, and their rivalry created this weird race to the bottom, where each side tried to prove it was more authentic by being more restrictive. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, the main idea comes down to a really important distinction: seeing this entire transformation as a product of history, not as some kind of religious destiny. And this lays it out perfectly. On one side, you have the faith of Islam, a 1,400-year-old tradition with incredible internal diversity in its theology, rituals, and ethics. On the other side, you have a modern, politicized ideology that uses the symbols of that faith for political power. What really took off after the 1970s was the ideology, but it presented itself as the entire faith. So the crucial point here is that this shift wasn't a natural evolution. It wasn't inevitable. It was a project. It took specific people, huge amounts of money, and very particular decisions made under the pressures of the Cold War and the oil boom to make it happen. Man, this quote from the source just says it all in one sentence, doesn't it? Replacing that diverse, pluralistic world with a much more rigid, homogenized one wasn't required by theology. It was a political project that succeeded. It was achieved. It wasn't preordained. And that kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. If this version of orthodoxy we see today isn't some timeless truth, but something that was built by specific historical forces, what does that mean for the future? If a story was written once, can it be rewritten?